All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Robert Vidigo. I'm your host for the workshop in International Survey Methods. And today we have the presentation of Professor Ka Ming. So Ka Ming is an assistant professor in comparative politics at Newcastle University, a member of the editorial board of Political Psychology Journal. His research agenda lies in the intersection of autocratization, radical politics, and elections. He has published works in the British Journal of Political Science, Political Behavior, Public Opinion Quarterly, Journal of Elections, Public Opinion Parties, and other scholarly journals. So today, Ka Ming will be presenting part of his large project on autocratization spillover. And thank you so much for being with us, Ka Ming, and the floor is yours.
Okay, good. Thanks, Robert, for the introduction, and thanks for having me. This is a project that is subsumed under my research agenda, Autocratization Spillover, and just to warn that it's actually a method paper measuring democratic attitude, but at the same time, I think it's very important that how we can measure democratic attitude and whether the authorization events abroad can change the democratic attitudes that this project is measuring. And this is a joint project with Tetsuo Kobayashi. Tetsuo Kobayashi is a political psychologist at Waseda University in Tokyo. And so here's the roadmap of this presentation. First, I will talk about the motivation of this project. And then second, I'll spend half of my time to talk about the measurement that we try to innovate. That's what we call we use a psychometric method in political psychology, which is called single target implicit association test to elicit anti-democratic attitudes. And talking about the anti-democratic attitude that we focus on is about the January 6th, the Capitol insurrection. More broadly, we think about self-coup as a kind of overturning the elections. And finally, this remaining time, I'll talk about the experiment that we launched. The experiment that we launched, we test whether authorization events abroad can change citizens' democratic attitudes, no matter implicitly or explicitly. So the motivation of this project is driven by these events. These are what we call self-coups. Talking about self-coups, actually, we noticed that in the past few years, we see that free election seems no longer be the only game in town. It's increasingly common for these elected authoritarians, when they lose power, they try to launch self-coup, attempting to take over the power by overturning election results. The classic case is, of course, January 6th Capitol insurrection in 2021, and also afterwards, the Brazil Congress attack in 2023 when Jair Bolsonaro lost his election. At the same time, it's not simply happened in the North America and the Latin America. In 2024, right after Christmas, the former president in South Korea also launched self-coup by suspending the legislature and judiciary. And I would like to highlight that these kinds of self-coup counter the conventional wisdom of the third authorization wave. That is, the conventional wisdom of our third authorization wave is that these elected authoritarians are supposedly using certain covert, that is very hidden bending the electoral rules or other kinds of media or civil society. Is supposed to be rather gradual, but these kind of self-coups are rather abrupt and blatant that try to destroy the democratic institution and norms. And so this is the motivation of this project. That is, we see it's increasingly common for elected authoritarians to attempt self-coups. But we find that it's quite challenging to measure support for these self-coups for one very important reason. That is, citizens' explicit approval or disapproval of a self-coup may not correspond to their implicit attitude. Here, this paper already tried to distinguish that there's one thing which is called explicit approval of a self-coup, and on the other hand, which is called implicit attitude towards the self-coup. And we think that there are one very important reason that these two things would diverge. That is the explicit attitude towards the self-coup and the implicit attitude towards the self-coup may diverge. That is, according to political psychology literature, that's what we call the concern about self-presentation. And we can further dissect, disentangle these self-presentation concerns into two roots. One root is about policy-sensitive bias, which I will talk about in the next slide, and the other is what we call expressive responding in survey. Talking about policy-sensitive bias, that is, in the past 2 years, we noticed that there are some scholars working on this front using conjoint experiment to test whether citizens support for overturning elections and parliament suspensions. What they find is that actually the price tag for citizens to sacrifice elections and to sacrifice parliamentary rule are quite high. That means they rather support the overt support for overturning elections and parliament suspension are quite limited. But then we have reason to think about that is using conjoint experiment to express explicit disapproval for self-goods may subject to policy sensitive bias. For one reason related to the political psychology literature, because we know that these self-groups would blatantly violate democratic norms, and these self-groups are quite violent most of the time. And so usually they have a kind of free norms, democratic norms that constrains citizens to express explicitly approval for these self-groups. And so the cost of explicit support for these self-groups is quite high. And this makes us to think about that is there may be reason that the implicit support for self-groups can be stronger than explicit support. We call these situations concealed authoritarians. That means actually these citizens, these concealed authoritarians, implicit support for self-groups is actually quite high, but then in terms of when they answer survey, they just hide these kind of support in the survey answers. That's one route talking about policy sensitive bias. The other route talking about the self-presentation concern, I think in this audience, there's a lot of US scholars, and so I think you will be quite familiar with this literature. There's what we call the Parson expressive responding. That is, parsons will usually answer survey, not generally, not their survey answers may not reflect their implicit attitudes. That is, when they try to answer surveys, they simply answer certain answers that reflect their Parson sentiment or identity. And there are some literature that suggests that explicit attitudes are more susceptible to elite hatred than implicit attitudes. Implicit attitudes usually is quite difficult to change, it's less malleable, but on the other hand, explicit attitudes are quite susceptible to elite hatred and susceptible to change in general. And related to the self-coup literature, we know that after self-coup or during self-coup erupted, a lot of elites would try to normalize these or using different reasons to justify the self-coup attempts. For example, talking about January 6th, they would talk about, oh, actually, it's simply protests grown out of hand, or because of electoral fraud that happened in 2020 election, even though it is not true. They simply think these kind of electoral fraud would justify the January 6th. That's what happened. And it's not, of course, not simply a US phenomenon. In South Korea, the former president of South Korea would talk about why he imposed martial law is because national security and the threat of communism. And so we think that it's possible that citizens' implicit support for self-goals can be weaker than explicit support. And this is what we call the performative authoritarians. In that case, actually, these partisans would simply approve self-coup is in order to express their partisan sentiment or defend their identity. But implicitly, their support for self-coup may not be that high. Now I move on to the psychometric technique that we try to measure the implicit attitude. We try to use single target IAT to elicit anti-democratic attitudes. Some basics about IAT, implicit association test, actually is quite a undercurrent in the political science research, measuring gender bias, racial bias, support for autocracy, and voting behavior. And in this paper, we try to extend to study self-coup in particular, and we use the case of January 6th to test it. We use the January 6th case of case of January 6 to test is because of the importance of its exemplar of self-groups. And we use a subtype of IAT, which is called single target. Stands for single target because Tesla, my co-author, and I are unable to find a good contrast. We thought the 1960s civil rights movement may be a good contrast, but at the end we dropped this idea, but rather focus on just one single target, namely January 6th. And so the IAT, IAT measure actually is to do some sorting tasks. The respondent need to perform certain sorting tasks. That is, they need to use their finger to press the E or I button. I will show how they do it in the subsequent slides. And I think this kind of technique is important because there's some discussion already in the survey literature that there's a lot of AI chatbot that answer surveys, but I don't think AI can currently deal with these kind of tasks. There's the sorting task at the moment using AI. Okay, here's an example of the racial biasing STIAT. Here, this is quite, I try to explain this slide that is in the middle. Let's focus in the center. There is a photo of a black person. It's a photo created by ChatGPT. And then the here, what is shown in the middle is what we call target. It can be a picture. It can be different black people picture. It can be female, elderly people, or children. And the second possibility is good words, beautiful, excellent, lovely, etc., etc. And it can also be bad words, horrible, awful, terrible, other bad words that you can think of. And so in this scenario, respondent need to sort the black photo to the left. And suppose the respondent exhibits a high level of racial bias, then you can imagine that he or she need to take a longer time period to do the sorting task to sort it to the left-hand side because the respondent has a very difficult time to think of to associate a black person with good. But on the other hand, the respondent would take a shorter time period to do the sorting task to the right because if a respondent is a racist, then he or she can easily do the sorting task and then sort the photo to the right-hand side because the respondent exhibits a high level of racial bias. And then we try to apply it, use this parallel to the case of January 6th. Suppose the respondent is it exhibits a very high level of anti-democratic. Think about it as MAGA. And in this scenario, the respondent would take a shorter time period to do this sorting task because the MAGA would definitely think that January 6th is a good thing. But on the other hand, MAGA would take a longer time period to do this sorting task in the right-hand side and then sort this photo to the right-hand side. And so basically, the idea of STIT is to calculate the difference between the two blocks. That is, whether the sorting time to the good or to the bad takes longer, and then we calculate the difference. And that's what we call the D-score. Basically, it quantifies the implicit association between the target, in our case is January 6th, and the attributes, whether it's good or bad. And then the D-score captures how quickly and accurately a person pairs the target with each attribute. And then talking about the D-score, I can talk about the algorithm in the Q&A session. It basically ranges from +2 to -2, and 0 means there's no strong implicit association. And talking about positive D-score, it means that there is a stronger association between January 6th and good, and negative score means stronger association between January 6th and bad. And now I move on to sample recruitment. We launched 2 pilots. First is how we select the photos. We launched a pilot to do the photo selection process. We also launched a SDIT pilot. Uh, the main survey of our analysis is we recruited 1,136 respondents. We only recruit persons because we want to replicate an experiment that I'll talk about later on. Because that experiment also just recruit persons, we try to keep it as consistent as possible. And then we recruit these respondents via prolific, which is supposedly national representative in terms of age, gender, and political affiliation. So first talk about the photo selection pilot. On the right-hand side, you see 6 photos. And basically, we first search Google using January 6, and we try to strike a balance between diversity and picture quality. That is in terms of the diversity related to January 6, and at the same time, we also consider picture quality. And then we ask 300 respondents whether each picture is representative of January 6 and whether they are familiar with that photo in particular. And then we calculate a certain indices. We chose in our pool, we chose 13, but at the end, the 6th photo that you see in this slide is actually the highest score in terms of the rating on these 2 dimensions. And then talking about the survey flow, on the left-hand side is the beginning. We collect certain social demographics that we basically use the ANES survey. And then we also collect certain political variables, PID, liberal, conservative, placement, and also thermometer. And then with these respondents are then randomized either to a treatment group or the pure control group. And afterwards, they would answer the question related to co-parsons undemocratic practices, which I will talk about in the next slide. And then lastly, to wrap up the survey, they need to do the IT test and the explicit support for January 6. And we randomize the order of the implicit and explicit support for January 6. So, okay, now we move on to the measurement of outcome. First, the box about the explicit support for co-parsons undemocratic practices. We basically adopt the vocal paper published in 2024, published in Science to ensure replicable. And it's basically ranged from 0 to 100 in terms of the scale. Here, they measure co-parson undemocratic practices on 4 aspects. One is about the polling station, and the second is about court rulings. That is whether in-party governors should ignore court rulings or not. The third aspect is about whether governors should prosecute journalists who accuse the out-party politicians of misconduct without revealing sources. And lastly, is about whether the in-party should not accept the results of election if they lose. And we use the composite score of these 4 items as our outcome. And talking about the self-coup explicit support for January 6, that is, we also use 4 items. The first item is what is your feeling towards what happened during January 6, 2021? And second is, do you approve or disapprove January 6? Third, do you think January 6 is good or bad for democracy? Lastly, do you think January 6 is good or bad for the country? And we find excellent internal consistency. The composite alpha is almost quite close to 1, and the average inter-item correlation is 0.88. Okay, then we now move on to validate the IT score. That is whether these implicit attitude towards a self-coup is a good measure or not. And then when we do the validation, we focus on only on the control group. Here's the distribution. Here's the distribution of the D-score. The 0 axis is slightly skewed to the right. But what you can see is that respondents on average have a D-score of negative 0.261. The implication is that actually respondents tend to associate January 6 with negative evaluation. But on the other hand, we also notice that right on the right-hand side of the D-score, the 0 axis, 30.1% of respondents have a D-score larger than 0. That means they have a relatively positive evaluation of January 6 implicitly. Of course, it's very important to separate whether it's that the distribution of Democrats and Republicans. And on the left-hand side, the blue line is the Democrats and the red line is Republicans. What you can see is that the Democrats' D-score is more negative, it's 0.398, and the Republicans' D-score is 0.112. Of course, as you can just look at the distribution, which Republican D-score was also negative, but then its magnitude is smaller than that of Democrats. The difference is high statistically significant. The magnitude is 0.286. And so it means that the association between January 6th and bad was weaker among Republicans, which aligned with our expectation. And at the same time, we also noticed that 20.1 of Democrats have a D-score larger than 0, and 41% of Republicans do. And other validation approach is to use certain outcomes to regress these outcomes. We use 4 outcomes to regress these 4 outcomes on both the explicit support for January 6th and also the implicit support for January 6th. This is a standard approach to test whether implicit support is still explain the variance, remaining variance of this outcome. And we find very strong support for this. That is, higher D-score is still associated with a greater likelihood of identifying as conservative, and they have a more favorable feeling towards MAGA supporters. And also, on the other hand, high D-score is associated with more negative feeling toward anti-VAR supporters and more negative feeling towards undocumented immigrants. And we also try to play around that we can sort it into 4 categories. That is, on the one hand, that we can think about high implicit and high explicit support for January 6th. We call it truthful authoritarians. That's the first row. The last row is what we call the truthful Democrats. That is, they both have low implicit and low explicit support for January 6th. But interestingly, is the difference. There's the divergence that I already mentioned in the very beginning. That is, there are concealed authoritarians and also performative authoritarians. That is, concealed authoritarians are those that have high support, high implicit support for January 6th, but low implicit support low explicit support for January 6th. And performative authoritarians is low implicit support for January 6th, but high explicit support for January 6th. Well, we are still thinking about what the interestingly we don't have this so high percent. That's the distribution that we find. But it's good thing that it's very good that the Democrats have a low implicit approval for January 6th and low explicit approval for January 6th. That is around 74%. Talking about Republicans, the distribution is much more different. That is, the Republicans, a lot of them have both high implicit and high explicit support for January 6th. And at the same time, we also notice the third row, that is performative authoritarians. They have low implicit support for January 6th, but then high explicit support for January 6th. And lastly, the last row, truthful Democrats, they are around 20%. One in 5 Republican are truthful Democrats. Okay, finally, can authorization events abroad change citizens' democratic attitudes? We launched an experiment to test because it's related to my research agenda. The theoretical basis is based on this paper by Jan Foucault. They published a mega study testing 25 treatment that to test whether which treatment can reduce anti-democratic attitudes and partisan animosity. And then one treatment that I find very interesting is the democratic collapse treatment. It is found to be one of the most effective treatment. The treatment effect size is the largest, one of the largest in reducing explicit support for undemocratic practices. And yeah, as I mentioned, it's linked to my research agenda, spillover effects in an authoritarian age. And the basic idea is that the democratic collapse in the foreign country may induce citizens to update their democratic attitudes. The theoretical basis of this idea is that authoritarian abroad can be regarded as an alternative scenario that introduces threats to democracy. And then exposure to authoritarian events abroad would highlight the democracy is more important, and they would the expectation of treatment is that it should reduce anti-democratic attitudes, both explicitly and implicitly. In our pre-registration plan, we try to hypothesize that the treatment of democratic collapse threat would reduce anti-democratic attitudes. And it also linked to other research that is we've published talking about democratic education, but then we try to inject a transnational dimension on it. Actually, in the past few years, some scholars are working very are trying to push forward. That is what helps to move democratic attitudes, to improve democratic attitudes. Uh, of course, one very important scholar is Anja Neuendorf from Glasgow University. But then in our treatment, we try to include a transnational dimension into our project. Okay, the treatment setup. The treatment setup involved two parts. One is the video of democratic collapse threat. We try to uh, basically use the science paper, the democratic collapse threat treatment in it. We try to maintain it as close as possible. This video will explain how authorization happened abroad. It includes four countries that recently collapsed in terms of their democratic system: Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Russia, and Turkey. And it will talk about incumbents' authoritarian acts, including how the incumbent tried to repress political opposition, overturn electoral results, and censor the media. And at the video end, it will ask respondent that is whether democracy could break down in the US. But at the same time, we try to cross out, we trim it, we cut the original scenes about January 6th, because in the original video of the democratic collapse thread, it suggests that January 6th it would threaten the US democracy. We try to cut it because we don't want to contaminate our IIT test. So here's a snippet of the video. I will try to, for the sake of time, I will just show you the last snippet. Here's the beginning of the video. Zimbabwe, I just go to the Turkey one. There may be some sound. It's basically like that. Of course, for the sake of time, I do not show the other countries. But basically, it is to prime citizens. That is, other countries exist. These kind of authorization happen in other countries, and could it happen in the U.S.? Is the basic idea. Okay, but then at the same time, there's something, some task in the after the video was shown. There's what we call the post-video reading task, in order to keep the treatment as close to the original treatment as possible. So the respondent, the treatment group, would read about actions they can take to protect democracy in the US. And these kind of actions include defending the right to vote, press freedom, and the separation of powers, and accepting electoral results even when losing. And so the treatment group would learn two things. One is the authorization in foreign countries, and the second thing is the actions that keep American democracy resilient. Here's the second post-video reading task. That is, they need to click the box, and here's the a snippet, a screenshot of the reading task. That is, defend the right to vote. For example, polling stations should be easy to access and available to everyone in both Republican and Democratic areas, and so on and so forth. That is, after you click it, then the second sentence will show pop up, and yeah, lastly, then it will move to answer those post-treatment outcomes. So the findings. What are the findings? How does these treatment can these treatment affect citizens' democratic attitude, no matter explicit or implicitly? What we find is that the treatment can only reduce explicit support for undemocratic practices. And also, explicit support for January 6 also reduce margin is statistically significant. Is in terms of 0.05 in terms of p-value, but implicit support for January 6 remains rather stable. But then here's the average treatment effect. And we also try to explore the Parson heterogeneity effect. Here are three panels. The left-hand side is the explicit support for co-Parsons undemocratic practices. In the middle, is the ITD score. The right-hand side is the explicit attitude towards January 6th. Is really counter our expectation. The idea is that the treatment can reduce Republicans' explicit support for undemocratic practice and also implicit support for January 6th and also explicit support for January 6th, which counter our expectation. And so the takeaway of this paper is that there are dissociation between explicit and implicit support towards self-coups. And so I think in terms of measuring democratic attitude, particularly support for self-coup, we need to be distinguish these two. And talking about the treatment, the authorization broad treatment can reduce explicit support, explicit approval for January 6th. But at the same time, in the exploratory heterogeneous analysis, we find that it will also reduce implicit approval for January 6th. Lastly, in terms of contribution, we try to broaden the measurement of democracy literature. And also, the treatment of our paper echoes the work on democratic education, but then we try to inject the transnational dimension into it. And lastly, we also try to enrich the transnational learning literature as well. Of course, there's some extension that we would like to do in the future, namely the Brazil case and the South Korean case. So here's the broader research agenda that I've been working on. Here's the last paper. Here's the last paper that we use a psychometric technique to tap into citizens' implicit approval for self-coups. Actually, I have other projects that study, for example, the second paper in BJPS is studying the US Capitol insurrection, and also the political behavior piece is the third one. The political behavioral piece is talking about the the election of Donald Trump, whether it changes citizens' democratic satisfaction with democracy, but then it's more observational data. And I think that's it from my side. I very much look forward to your thoughts and comments because it's the first time that I present this project. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ka Ming. Um, yeah, let's open the floor for questions. You can unmute yourself. You can text the chat. Please feel free. Anyone working with authoritarianism abroad? All right, so I'll get us started. Oh, Luke.
Yeah, I am kind of unfamiliar with this IAT method, so I was a little unclear about how it works exactly. So I was just wondering, um, can you clarify, like, okay, so the people are showing these different six images. Are they all, everybody's showing the same six images, or it's kind of randomized, or how is that?
That's a good question. I need to clarify. This is what we call actually four blocks. Four blocks. The first is the trial box, and the second block is the really to do the test. The trial box is usually around 12 trial. We set it as 15 trial. That means the target in the middle, it can include pictures and also the words, the good word, bad words. And then, yeah, it can be the order of the words and picture are randomized. It's basically randomized. And then to do the task. Yeah. And so the first in the first block, it can be include 15 targets, and then it can include three pictures, 6 words, and then 6 good word, and then 6 bad word, and then do the sorting task. That's the trial block. And then the second is redo the test, and then we calculate. That's one part of the association, the sorting. And then the third block is about we then flip the other side, flip the January 6 to the other side. Because in the first block, it can be January 6 good, but then in the third block, it will flip it to January 6 bad. And then do it again to do the trial and the calculation of the input that calculate the D-score.
And you know from your pilot that everybody kind of knows what this is about, like what the pictures are depicting, or like some of them seemed like, yes, I can associate that with January 6th, but a few of them seem more like it could be a few different contexts. So
The familiarity score is quite high. It reaches 0.88. Overall, on a 0 to 1 is 0.88
I
on
see.
average on these photos. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to go to results in the US between Democrats and Republicans coming. Um, yeah, so those results they make sense because it really like mirrors findings in the US politics since, early 2000s. I'm mostly thinking here on the work of like Mark Harrington on the idea that like the parties in the US are sorted by authoritarianism, right? So the authoritarians, they have sorted into the Republican Party. So based on that result, and I'm curious about, was not very clear to me if are we seeing more these concealed authoritarians or are we seeing more these performative authoritarians based on this distinction that you create in your work? The table with like the percentage, so like across the four types of authoritarians in between Democrats and Republicans really shows the sorting. But like I'm curious, like what are you, which side of the weight scale are we falling? Are we falling more like we're seeing more concealed authoritarians, or are we seeing more this like performative, expressive authoritarians?
For Republican in particular, is the highest percentage among the four categories is actually the performative authoritarians. In a certain sense, is a good thing. That means the implicit attitude among these Republicans are not that high within Republican. Within
Hmm.
Republican. Yeah. That means they are, in terms of their explicit support, is above zero, but then implicitly they are negative. That's the basic idea of performative authoritarian.
Got it. We have a question in the chat from Kim. Could you clarify the conceptual differences between implicit and explicit support for January 6th? And again, the difference in measurement.
Okay, I think I need to share the slides again.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Here. Oh, sorry. Here's the explicit support for January 6. It uses four items to tap into citizen explicit support for January 6, whereas implicit support is during the sorting task that we talked about in the first half of this presentation. The difference in time in terms of the association sorting task, whether it's January 6 to good and January 6 to bad, is the implicit support for January 6. I hope I answer your question, but if not, I'm happy to clarify.
I guess I'm pretty surprised that the performative authoritarianism was the most common type. Like my impression or expectation would be most people, most Republicans in the case of January 6th would, explicitly say it's wrong, but, maybe have some sympathy for the protesters. So, was that your expectation too? You didn't necessarily have hypotheses, but was that what surprising to you, and what are the implications of that?
We don't have do not formulate expectation for it. We simply when we try to write the paper, is simply the two diverge. There may be possibility of the divergence, but divergence can be two ways. The two ways is the concealed authoritarians and performative authoritarians. But in terms of percentage, we don't have a clear expectation because it's the first time. I think it's the first time in the scholarship that we study uh, the yeah the both implicit and explicit. Uh, but in terms of implication, I think I previously mentioned that is in a sense that means Republicans have not. I mean they are simply expressive responding. That is, they are responding. Oh, January 6th is their can be their issue, and they need to review their partisan support explicitly in terms of answering survey, but then in terms of implicit, when they do the IT task, they still would associate January 6 on average to the negative side.
Now, I want to hear your thoughts coming on now on like an international perspective, let's say, because as you said, like the treatment that tends to be stronger is the democratic collapse in a foreign country, right? You show people about democratic collapse in a foreign country, and that really affects the attitudes, especially in the case of Republicans there. So you mentioned they have interest in working in Brazil and South Korea. So we have elections in Brazil this year, and we're having we had elections in Peru this last weekend, right? In Peru, we have Keiko Fujimori and Rafael Aliaga, which are both conservative politicians. And I guess like Aliaga, it's like ultra conservative, like more conservative than her. So I'm wondering if and the runoff is likely is going to be between those two. We still don't know because vote counting issues in the country, but it's very likely that we're going to have this like super conservative um, um, president in Peru. So I'm wondering if about your thoughts about like what if Peru has a lesson or maybe a spillover effect in Brazilian elections this year.
Let me think about because I'm not familiar enough with the Latin American Peruvian case.
But based on your theory, we have the case of, like a let's democratic collapse, let's say, in this country that's like not far from Brazil. So I'm wondering if this can be an let's say a treatment for Brazilian voters this coming elections.
You mean the democratic collapse in the U.S. or
In Peru.
in Peru? I think it depends on one thing, that is whether the in that case, that is whether the respondent in the survey are familiar with the Peruvian situation enough.
Yeah.
Because the treatment is a kind of like we show that democracy is collapsing, and that yeah, it's a kind of threat to democracy. That is, would it happen in the case of US, right? And so I think it's to yeah. But at the same time, we show those usual suspect of democratic collapse, Russia, Venezuela, and also Turkey and Zimbabwe. And so, yeah, we of course we try to replicate, but at the same time, I think it really depends on whether respondents are familiar with those those situations. in other countries. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, Ashley, please.
Hi, thank you for this presentation, really interesting. Um, I'm curious about how you're thinking about the implicit association measure and how it differs from the explicit measure in terms of there's two reasons I think why you might expect different results from the explicit. One is this self-presentational concerns, social desirability bias that you talked about. But the other is this sort of automated responses aspect of the implicit association test. You're measuring people's very quick reactions to something and at speed rather than when they're able to sort of think about, what do I think about this carefully. And so I'm wondering how, especially that second aspect that differs between the implicit association measure you used and the explicit measure, how you think that might affect the responsiveness to the treatments that you use. So that was the first question. The second was about the explicit measure you used. It looked like the explicit measure was pretty similar to, I think it was the reading treatment, that you're basically kind of informing, having people kind of admit to, or say that they've read this message that looks very similar to the explicit measure. And so with that kind of instruction, you're also revealing what you as the researcher think or something along those lines. And so it's very close to the explicit measure. How does that affect the way that this explicit measure, or this treatment would affect these two different measures relative to each other?
Yeah, that's great questions. Talk about the treatment effects on both the implicit measure and the explicit measure. The explicit measure had two parts. One is about the co-partisan undemocratic practice, right? Because we try to replicate for example, talk about the polling station, whether they respect the judiciary and or whether they censor the media. This is what we try to replicate the DV, and the effect size is quite large. We confirm the previous findings. And of course, the reading task would, the reading task and these explicit measures are quite aligned in terms of wording. They quite align with each other. And so what we suspect is that it's possible because of what we call, I can measure the challenge about demand effect, but at the same time, we try to replicate as much as possible in terms of explicit measure. But at the same time, the explicit measure has an other part, which is the explicit support for January 6th. And in that case, we still find there's a significant effect, although the magnitude is smaller than the comparison that comparison undemocratic practices. And that's one. That's the answer for the second question. And for the first question, talking about the reaction time, actually the D-score calculation would punish the respondent if they solve the task wrongly. That means if they solve the January 6th to the side that do not have January 6th, then it would be shown a cross. And then the algorithm, according to previous scores, they would just do some minus or deduction that would take that into account. That's one thing. But then methodologically is the trick. I mean, in terms of previous psychology literature, they suggest that the implicit measure is much more difficult to fake and less malleable compared to explicit measure.
I guess I'm thinking about it just not that it's necessarily like people are faking it. I'm curious conceptually about how to think about implicit measures of authoritarian attitudes, and kind of the similarities and differences to how these tools have been used for example, measuring implicit racial attitudes. Because there is the compounding effects of like, you don't conceal the attitude because you aren't able to in these kinds of measures. And so it's less vulnerable to social desirability bias, but it's also this kind of, I don't know, thinking fast and slow difference between these measures. And so it's less of a criticism and just more I'm curious about whether, like, in what context, what are the political stakes that people having implicit automated responses that are more authoritarian? if that makes sense. Like it's not just that they're concealing, but they have a generally like a quick gut reaction to January 6th imagery that's positive, versus thinking carefully about, strongly support this is, I have this well thought out idea about January 6th, if that makes sense. That difference.
That's a very important question. I think we need to, I mean, Tatuo and I need to think about more carefully. That is whether there's, I know the second part is more recent, right? That means they really think about, oh, January 6th is a good thing for democracy. I mean, empirically, it's possible. Empirically, it's possible. Whereas the first is more gut feeling, right? The gut feeling. The second is more reason. That's an important distinction. And yeah, I can imagine this. The gut feeling would take shorter to associate January 6th with good. Whereas the second scenario, we didn't think too much about it, and I think it's important to think about how to link it to IIT measure. Yeah, that is after a lot of deliberation, they internalize it that actually January 6th is good for democracy, and they try to associate with good, right? Yeah, that's what we call the internalization process. Yeah, that's a good point.
So we have time for one more question.
One more curiosity. So the in the second study, the treatment video, so you had four different countries, Turkey, Venezuela, I can't remember the other two, but you have a mix of kind of left and right governments. So it's wondering if there might be like a moderating effect, like if a Republican sees a leftist government or auto coup, that activates something. But if it's right, then, if they're a Trump ally, if it's Orban doing it, they're like, well, that's right. So I guess you can't really separate out like what the treatment is based off that data. But do you have any thoughts about that?
I think the original intention of the treatment is to include different diverse ideology of elected authoritarians in order to balance that kind of, because I can imagine I can include all right-wing authoritarians like Viktor Orban, John Bolsonaro, and yeah, Netanyahu in Israel. Yeah, and so I think the idea of the treatment is to try to strike a balance. Is some are less ideologically clear, like the Turkish one. One may not very easily to fit into the left right, but at the same time, it also include the left-wing authoritarian at the same time. To try to balance. Of course, the treatment effect cannot tease out which of authoritarians the authorization process drive the effect. Yeah.
Great.
Interesting study.
Thanks,
Yeah.
thanks for having me. Thanks for having me. That's the first
Yeah.
time that I present this project, and it's very good to have American scholar to share with you.
Awesome. Thank you, Ka Ming, and everyone for joining us throughout the Wisdom series this spring semester. We really appreciate the thoughtful discussions that make the Wisdom series so valuable. It's really important to us. And as this is our final talk of the spring semester, we will be sharing the agenda for the fall Wisdom series in August, and we look forward to see you all in the fall. Have a great day, everyone, and have a great rest of your week.